All righty. Let me know if you can see my slides here. Good. Awesome. Okay, well, first, thank you so much for having me today. UUP has done so much impressive work, and even just now I've learned even more work that you all have done and just creating the spaces that are inclusive, but also promote action, which is like another really critical piece of that too. So thank you for all your work and thanks for having me. My name is Maeve Kline. I work, as Fred said, in our government relations department at AFT. So I handle some of our federal legislative issues, and this is one of those and one that's really important to me. So and also, like you mentioned, I went to school in New York, in upstate New York. So I'm very familiar with the SUNY system, and I just want to thank you all for all the work you do every day. It's very important. I won't take up, or I'll try not to take up too much of your time, but I just wanted to kind of focus on the legislative landscape across the country and then kind of dive in a little bit more on the federal issues in this space and the kind of the ongoing and some recent wins in this space. So of course, if you have any questions, my email's on the slide here, but I'll also put it in the chat. Feel free to reach out at any time if you have any questions or want to follow up on any of the things I talk about today. All right, so I think we're all really aware of this huge increase in legislative attacks in the LGBTQ communities and states across the country. And these particularly have been targeting, especially in this last year or so, transgender youth and students. And as you can see on the slide, like I said, it's happening across the country. In the first 2 weeks of this year, actually, 23 different states introduced or already had pre-filed more than 150 anti-LGBTQ bills. And then within the first few months of the year, that number rose to over 428 anti-LGBTQ plus bills introduced across the country. And unfortunately, that number is growing. On the positive side, I will say about a little over 90% of those bills that have been targeting specifically transgender children have failed, but there have been about 17 or so that have passed, and that impacts a lot of our students and just a lot of our communities across the country. So it's a real thing that's happening. It's a scary thing for a lot of people, and rightly so. These attacks, though, these legislative bills that are being proposed or passed are even more far-reaching than just access. I mean, they cover access to healthcare, what books can be in schools. There's more than 200 bills that have been introduced on book bans or censoring in some form across states. And these what discussions can be had, what history is being taught. It kind of touches this it across the board, right? And we know that this has effect on students. It has an effect on professors. You see this play out in campuses and communities in the classrooms. It's these debates in particular, like it's not even when, I mean, obviously when the bills are passed, but particularly even just the conversations and the platform that is being given to these issues are really hurting our students and our community's mental health. And like I said, that plays out in the classrooms, that plays out in the communities, on our campuses, in our hospitals. So I know I'm going to focus primarily on these federal issues, but I just thought it was important to kind of lay a little bit of a landscape to kind of see, so we have some context when we're looking at what's happening federally. So President Biden has been a real champion in the space from his first day in office. He signed one of the most comprehensive executive orders on LGBTQ rights. It called on departments across the administration to enforce the civil rights laws to prevent discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And then consistently since then, you can see some examples here. But he's been fighting to pass legislation and then also using his executive powers to ensure that LGBTQ Americans are protected, feel safe, and respected. Some of those executive orders include directing federal agencies to protect LGBTQ families and youth, to support youth mental health, to stop harmful conversion therapy policies. He's ordered the Department of Justice to support challenges to state laws that target transgender kids. And then in light of the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe versus Wade, he took action to protect marriage equality by signing into the Respect for Marriage Act into law, which basically ensured that couples, LGBTQ couples and interracial couples are respected and protected equally under the law as all marriages are. Then last but not least, and during Pride Month in particular, if you've seen some clips and whatnot of President Biden speaking, he often calls for the passage of the Equality Act, which I'll talk about here in a little bit, but it would basically enshrine civil rights protections for LGBTQ Americans and enshrine that into federal law. So as I just mentioned, the Respect for Marriage Act was signed into law last winter, and kind of takes you through on these slides or on the graphics here, kind of the process and the stages which federal legislation has to go through to work its way to finally get made into law. But the Respect for Marriage Act was really significant because it was right after Roe versus Wade was overturned. So rightfully so, there was a lot of concern on whether the same situation, the same outcome could happen with same-sex marriage if in fact that Supreme Court case was overturned. So this bill repealed the Defense of Marriage Act, which said marriage was just between a man and a woman, and then so thereby it kind of excluded just the dignity, but then also real benefits like Social Security benefits, tax benefits, and more pieces like that are really important. And that was obviously overturned in 2015 by the Supreme Court decision. But again, because of Roe being overturned, there was a lot of concern that the same thing could happen there. So that's why this bill was really important. The other key bill, which I mentioned earlier, that we're all trying to get passed is the Equality Act. And that would provide consistent and explicit protections or anti-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people across all areas of life, including employment, housing, education, public services, public or federally funded programs. And that bill is introduced. It had been led by Representative Cicilline, who's no longer in the House. So now it's by Takano in California, and then Senator Merkley is the Senate lead there. But there's a lot of support in the House. This is kind of, or in Congress, this is kind of the primary federal bill in this space. And just one thing that I think is important to mention, because if we're lucky to live in states where some of these are like these rights are already protected and pretty well enforced, it's important to remember that almost half of, I think it's about 47% of the LGBTQ community of the people live in states actually where, for example, housing discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation is actually not protected. So it's a real thing for a lot of people, and just based on who they are, and that's not something we want. So the Equality Act would amend existing civil rights law, so like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Fair Housing Act, big pieces of legislation like that, and explicitly include sexual orientation and gender identity as protected characteristics. And it would also amend the Civil Rights Act to protect discrimination in these like public spaces and federally funded programs on the basis of sex. So, and I'll also, AFT has a link to an e-action that we have up, because this Equality Act was just reintroduced about a week or so ago. So we have an action up that I'll put in the chat that we're asking folks to send a letter to their members of Congress and their senators saying that this is a priority for you, even if they already support this bill, to remind them that it's really important, and we're asking them to kind of help push it over the finish line here. So there's a lot of other bills that have been introduced in this space. Some of them are listed here on the slide, but that all kind of help us try to get closer to true equality and representation under federal law. And if there's any questions you have on any of them, or if you want any more information on any of these bills or others that you've heard of, or any other issues in the space, I'd be happy to follow up with you, and I'll put my email in the chat. I know that was a lot of information, but if you have any questions, like I said, don't hesitate to reach out. And I think I'm handing it over to Chris now.
Yes, but before we get there, there's been some comments in the chat that I just wanted to touch on. I mean, I've never looked at this as the point of the travel ban, non-essential state travel ban, to be punitive for UUP members or someone's professional development, but really focusing on the aspect of getting somebody where it hurts, and often that's in the pocketbook, and also to use that perhaps as a means to have organizations who do plan conferences, for example, to be mindful of what's going on around the country and the world, and to consider not holding a conference in a state that would upset a group of people that have already expressed an opinion on this, for example, UUP, and to maybe plan the conference in Chicago as opposed to Houston, for example. So again, it's not to be punitive or to hinder any progress in a professional development manner for UUP members. So thanks, Chris.
Okay. Thank you, Kelly, and good afternoon, everybody. As Fred mentioned, my name is Chris Black. I'm the Director of Legislative and Political Affairs for UUP, and I'm happy to be here and be a part of this panel joining you today. So what I want to do today is two things, really. One, do a brief overview of the bill, and then two, I want to talk about some strategy that we may want to use to get the bill enacted, signed into law, and then also talk about both the state budget and legislative process that we'll have to navigate to realizing that goal. So we are talking about Senate 5463 by Senator Jackson and Assembly 1943 by Assemblymember Gonzalez Rojas. The bill in the Senate is in the Finance Committee and the Governmental Operations Committee in the Assembly. And I want to say we're very fortunate to have two sponsors of this legislation that have been strong advocates for social justice issues throughout their careers. They have, not only are they strong advocates, they have loud voices, and they're not afraid to use those voices. So we're very fortunate in that regard. So I think we're in good stead with the sponsorship of this legislation, and we will be working with them hand in glove to try to get this bill passed. So what does the bill do next? It does essentially four things. First, it mandates a review of any travel request that is state-funded and state-sponsored travel request, meaning the state would have to expend money for that travel by any state agency, any state division, commission, department, to states that after January 1st, 2024, that next, can you hit the next slide, please? That either have enacted laws to repeal or have the effect of repealing any state or local protections against certain discrimination next, or have enacted laws that authorize or require discrimination against same-sex couples and their families. And the discrimination in this legislation is defined as, if next, it's defined on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. So if there's a travel request for any state-funded, state-sponsored travel, not personal travel, no, the state of New York cannot ban you from personally traveling to any state in our nation or anywhere else for that matter. But if there's a request for state-funded and state-sponsored travel, that will be reviewed, okay, for those states who are engaging in discriminatory practices. The second thing that this bill does, it suspends that travel to those states. Again, I want to be clear, it's state-funded, state-sponsored, so the state expending that money. The third thing the bill does, it requires the New York State Attorney General to develop and maintain a list of those states that are engaged in this discriminatory practices, and it requires her to post that list on her website. And finally, the last thing the bill does, it provides some exemptions, specifically for travel that is necessary for the enforcement of New York State law, travel that is necessary to meet prior contract obligations, if it is deemed that travel is necessary for protection of public health, welfare, and safety. And finally, if it is deemed that travel is in the interest of New York State. Now, in the chat section, and Kelly touched upon this a few minutes ago, people may have concerns about their professional development going to states. I just want to make clear that no piece of legislation is static, right? It can be changed if this is something that people feel is necessary to put in an exemption for. That's something that could be entertained. So I just want to throw that out there. So that, in a nutshell, is what the bill does. Okay. Now I want to turn to the next slide and talk about the legislative strategy and the process that we're going to have to navigate through, both the state budget process and the legislative process. So I view this as, next slide, please. I view this as really two bites of the apple, okay? The first bite would be advocating for the inclusion of this legislation to be in the executive budget. Now, every fall, early fall, the governor will assemble her executive staff, the Division of Budget staff, to contemplate what she's going to proffer in her executive budget submission, which is due mid-January 2024. So that's when she needs to submit her executive budget to the state legislature. That process goes through the fall. We would want to advocate, reach out to the executive budget staff, Division of Budget, try to get our legislation in that budget. Now, while the state budget has many bills to it, there are typically 9 bills in budget bills as part of the whole state budget. There are only two types of bills. There's appropriation bills and there's language bills, Article 7 bills, we call them. We would want to try to get this legislation included in the Article 7 bill. And if we are successful in doing that, it is unlikely that the legislature, both houses of the legislature, would take that out or omit that legislation in the final enacted budget. So the governor will issue her executive budget in January, mid-January. The next step, the legislature analyzes that budget. In late January, February, they hold hearings on that budget. Fred testifies every year on behalf of UUP. Then by usually the second week of March, the legislature will introduce their one-house budgets. Now, these bills or resolutions, the Senate usually does a resolution, the Assembly does actual budget language. These submissions really outline what each house's priorities are. So if we have this bill in the executive budget, it is unlikely, never say never, but I would deem it unlikely that each house is going to take or out or omit in their one house budgets the executive inclusion of this bill. So, and from after the one house budgets, we move into the final budget negotiations between the governor and both houses of the legislature, and hopefully the budget is passed, the final budget is passed by April 1st or thereabouts. And if we are able, again, to get this in the executive budget, it is the best route for achieving success in getting this bill enacted. But however, if we are unable to do that, the second way to do that is the traditional way. And next slide. We would have to advocate for the standalone passage in both houses of the legislature. That is Senate 5463 and Assembly 1943. Typically, from January through April, everything in the legislature is focused on the budget. So if we were not successful in that endeavor and getting it in the state budget, we would be talking about as soon as the state budget is done through June, depending on the year, the legislature adjourns either first week, second week in June. So we would have that time to lobby the legislature. In particular, we would work with Senator Jackson, Assemblymember Gonzalez Rojas in the Assembly, and we would work with them to lobby the chairs of the committees where the bill resides. Currently, the bill resides in the Senate Finance Committee. Senator Kruger would be the person we would try to advocate to get her to put it on a committee agenda for the Senate Finance Committee. From there, it would go to Senate Rules. After Senate Rules, it would go to the floor of the Senate. On the Assembly side, it is in government operations. The chair of that committee is Assemblyman John McDonald. We would lobby Assemblyman McDonald to put it on a governmental operations committee agenda. From there, it would move to the Ways and Means Committee. That's the fiscal committee in the Assembly. And then from there to the Rules Committee, and then onto the floor. So that is the process. I will stop there and leave. I know we're concerned about time. I'll give some time for questions if there are any.
Thank you, Chris. Do we have any questions? So that was a nice breakdown. And as with anything, you know, when it's about learning how sausage is made, it can be a little disturbing at times that things can be so complicated, but we do need to work within the reality of our legislature, and the steps that we need to take would be as outlined by Chris. So are there any questions about that or anything else we've discussed today? If not, I also want to take the last couple of minutes to discuss sort of next steps that I had already considered and really focusing perhaps next year on advocating for the Equal Rights Amendment that we have coming up for New York State that would enshrine in our Constitution equal rights for those protected classes that we've been discussing here today. Also, I already extended an invitation for those who are here to consider joining the Gender and Sexuality Interest Committee, but I also would like to promote some of the other human and civil rights committees that we have within UUP, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, the Women's Concerns Committee, Disability Rights Committee, Veterans Affairs Committee, and I'm probably missing one that is not coming to my head right now. But please consider your involvement in leadership in UUP, and one good way to do that is joining a committee of interest to you. And yes, Dawn, if you go to the website, the uupinfo.org, and you go to about, you go to leadership, and that's a key that all of our committee lists are located under leadership, and then you'll see officers, e-board, I think, staff, and state committees. And then you'll see the listing of state committees and emails of those chairs, whom you can then directly contact. And again, just to remind everyone, I did put it in the chat, but the official process to join a committee requires the chapter president's approval, the chair's approval, and then of course the statewide executive board votes on all committee memberships at the end as well. So, any other questions before we say goodbye today? I thank you, Don. Does anybody on the panel have any final words they would like to share?
Just thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you to all the panelists and to all the participants, and happy Pride. I know it's the end of the month. Pride month is almost over, but just remember you can be prideful in any month of the year. So, all right, thank you all.
Thank you for allowing me to participate. I think it goes to Fred.
Okay, all right. Again, I want to thank our panelists, Maeve, Chris, Carolyn, Kelly, for all that you did in presenting this important information. And then also, I'd like to thank Danielle Judge, Josh Sprague for their work. They're our staff, fantastic staff that made today's presentation work. And so again, a reminder, this is our union. It belongs to all of us. We can make it what it is, and we can be proud of what it does by what we choose to do with the power we have as individuals and as part of the labor movement, and more importantly, all of the work that goes into making our world a better place. So with that, thanks very much. Have a wonderful day. And also, we have a weekend coming up, and it's worth celebrating since some of the principles that we claim to live by as a nation were encapsulated, at least in the early words of the Declaration of Independence, that all of us are equal. And so think of that as we are enjoying this weekend, and think about those rights that we have fought for well over 200 years, and how important it is to defend them, or they can be lost. So with that, thanks again. Take care, everyone, and we'll see you on the road.